Thank you for your patience. Just now we were taking a photo to record the event and so that we can transmit that message to the donors who've built and created a fund which supports the Harcourt Visiting Professorship. And each visiting professor is asked to give a lecture, and it's a great pleasure to have Richard Baldwin here tonight to give the lecture for this year. To introduce Richard, I'm going to invite the Vice-Chancellor of the University, Professor Warren Bevington, to make the opening remarks.
Thank you, Christopher. Good evening, everybody. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains, the land on which our campuses at North Terrace, Theberton, Waite and Roseworthy are built. Our special guest, Emeritus Professor Jeff Harcourt, after whom these lectures are named, unfortunately can't be with us tonight, but we'll be watching, I understand, on the video link, so we're very sorry he can't be here. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the event, which has been an important part of the university's calendar for several years now. It's a platform to hear a distinguished colleague in the field of economics, a field of great interest to us all. But it's also an opportunity to reflect on the major achievements of Jeff Harcourt, his legacy and his ongoing relationship with the university. We're proud of our long association with Professor Harcourt. It started in 1958 when he was appointed lecturer in economics at the university, followed by his appointment as Professor of Economics in 1967. Throughout his time, Jeff also lectured at Cambridge University, where he received his doctorate and was a fellow at Trinity Hall. During the 1980s and 90s, he held various positions at Cambridge, including Reader in Economics and President of Jesus College, Cambridge. He's received worldwide recognition for his work on post-Keynesian economics. He was made an Officer of the Order of Australia and in 2011 was recipient of the Veblen Commons Award, the highest academic honour given by the Association for Evolutionary Economics. It's awarded to scholars who have substantially advanced our understanding of economics and how economies actually work. Tonight celebrates our links with Professor Harcourt and also serves to highlight the Harcourt Visiting Professorship. The Visiting Professorship was established by generous donations in recognition of the 25 years of distinguished scholarship which Jeff Harcourt gave us here at the School of Economics. Each year the endowment invites a global leader in the field of economics to share the knowledge and experience with us, not only with students and staff but also with the broader community. Within our School of Economics, the Harcourt Professorship has helped to foster an intellectual environment, inject new ideas and provide staff and students with exposure to the frontiers of economic research. Tonight, our speaker is someone who's played a major role at the very highest levels of economic policy, Professor Richard Baldwin. Richard has been Professor of International Economics at the Graduate Institute, Geneva, since 1991. He's a part-time visiting research professor at the University of Oxford, Policy Director of the Centre for Economic Policy Research, and Editor-in-Chief of the policy website Vox, which he founded in 2007. From 1990 to 91, he was a senior staff economist for the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the George Bush Senior Administration. At that time, he was on leave from the Columbia University Business School. He's also been a visiting professor at MIT and has taught at universities in Italy, Germany and Norway. He's also worked as a consultant for numerous governments, the European Commission, the OECD and the World Bank. The author of numerous books and articles. His research interests include international trade, globalization, regionalism and European integration. Ladies and gentlemen, to present the 2013 Harcourt Lecture, Misthinking Globalisation. Would you please welcome Professor Richard Baldwin.
Now, just to change things, I've changed my slides around a little bit because I was misthinking globalization, and now I'm thinking about it right. So if I just put this in here, it should work, I'm guessing. Okay, yeah. So I'll get started. Well, if you can break, I put it on this stick. So if you, switch the mic off. Okay, so let me just get started a little bit with the things I don't need the slide for. First of all, let me thank you for those kind words. It's a great honor to give the Harcourt Lecture. I saw that Avinash Dixit gave it last year, and he's a great friend of mine. I have never met, actually, Jeff Harcourt, but I looked him up on the video, and he looked like a charming man. I hope I will meet him in the future. Now, today I want to talk to you about globalization. So what does globalization mean? Any ideas? Nobody here studied globalization? Books about it? Nobody dares? Well, tonight, I want to change the way you think about globalization. Not completely, not a revolution, just something like a 20% course correction. Because I think governments and scholars are misthinking globalization, and this is leading to some very important mistakes when it comes to policy and also design of research and misunderstanding what's going on in the world. So with that challenge, let me start here and state the conventional view. So I think we could say this is a conventional view of globalization. That we go back in time and it was extremely difficult for countries to trade with each other, so they were in isolation or autarky. There was no trade. And now we're gradually moving towards a flat world where everything is integrated. In other words, we're moving from no trade to free trade slowly. That is the traditional globalization narrative. That's how we think about globalization. And it's how we think about how globalization will influence our economies going forward. So let me get you comfortable with that. Let me explain to you why this is also thoroughly embedded in the minds of scholars and governments. Because it worked for 150 years. So what we have here is, I only go back to 1870 to 1990, globalization was, I had a lot of coffee, sorry about that. Globalization was associated with lower trade costs. So let's see how that worked. From about 1815, really 1820 to 1913, trade costs fell radically. This was the steam revolution. Basically, as we moved from horse carts and sailing ships to steamships and the railroad, the world got closer. The world opened up, and vast tracts of the world opened up to trade. At the same time, trade expanded very rapidly, prices converged. Many of the wonders of today's world started to be seen, with the Industrial Revolution being perhaps the leading one. Between 1913 and 1950, the world went crazy. We had World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. From the perspective of globalization, there was a massive de-globalization. Although transportation technology got a bit better, tariffs shot up in the 1930s, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. So frequently, countries around the world would have tariffs of 50, 60, 70%. And that was enough to pretty much shut off trade for most things. The curtain opens again in 1950, and trade liberalization gradually moves us back towards a more open world. Trade costs, this includes tariffs and trade and transportation costs, fall gradually, and trade rises. So here we go, perfectly fine. The world's too complex to understand, so we need a narrative to decide what to ignore. This narrative was focused on trade costs because that's really what's going on. Although there's globalization of taste, migration, technology, all these things do go on, but the primary narrative is that globalization is about trade costs being reduced. So, if this is still true, we should see that globalization is one process, and as you can see here, has been having the same effect on the world economy from about 1820 to 2012. Or maybe not. What we see here is from 1820, when steam really started going, up to 1993, globalization was associated with an agglomeration of economic activity in the G7. So the G7 is the large 4 European economies: Germany, France, Italy, and the UK, the US, Japan, and Canada. So as the world got closer, it became worthwhile to concentrate production. That scale gave great advantage to those who were ahead, and as globalization proceeded, economic activity agglomerated in the rich countries. And that's the way the world was when I got my PhD. 2/3 of world output was in just 7 countries. And if you put in a few more, it'd be 80% were in the rich countries, the rest of the 20% was there. But as you can see, something changed around 1990. This process of globalization, in 20 years, moved 2/3 of world GDP down to under half. The last 20 years have seen the G7's GDP share back down to 1900. I would submit to you that we need a new narrative of globalization. And it will not involve one process. It will involve 2. That's my point tonight. Now, let me move on a bit. As I said, I like to call this globalization as the great unbundlings with an S. That's the title of a paper I wrote for the Finnish Prime Minister's office in 2006. So there's some good news and bad news in that. One is this idea about 2 processes is beginning to get some traction, gets written up, paid attention to a little bit by governments and whatnot. The bad news is it took 7 years. I've been talking about this for 7 years. Point is, we need a narrative with 2 processes, not 1. Now, I've done this a number of times, and I've decided tonight to do this a little bit like a treasure hunt. After all, it is Halloween. Actually, we don't have treasure hunts on Halloween, but anyways, let's go with the flow. That's the best I can think of. Okay, so what we're going to do is follow the clues. Globalization has changed. You saw that with the G7's GDP. But what could it be? Any ideas? For those who haven't read my book? Okay. Well, let's see. Let's find out. Let's look at the first one. So this first slide is going to look a little more closely at this GDP shares that I talked about before. So this only begins in 1960 because that's when we have good data on basically every country in the world, so we can do a global study here. So if you go from 1960 up to 1990, the G7 share is rising very slowly up to about 2/3, and then it plummets as we saw that before. Now, let's see, where did those shares go? What we can see here is that there's 10 countries who've seen their share of global GDP rise by more than 1% over this time during the 20 years. And they went from 11% up to 27%, the 10 gainers. The rest of the world didn't change much. So this was not like some magic fairy dust sprinkled on the world economy from 1990 that made all rich countries poor and all poor countries rich. It was incredibly specific, just 10 countries. You may be interested to know, if I stretch that to 11 countries, Australia would be the 11th country. So what's going on since 1990, it has been very good for Australia. Okay, let's look what happened to poverty. Very different thing, basically related. From 1980 to 1993, that's the longest statistics we have from the World Bank, poverty was rising in low and low-middle income nations, and it was flat in high and middle income nations. From 1990, poverty plummeted in the middle-high income countries. 650 million fewer poor people at this time. But in the other countries, poverty kept rising. Let's look at manufacturing. All of us know, I was just reading the newspaper today, Australia may lose its last auto factory. Something's happening to manufacturing. So here, what we have is the global statistics, only goes back to 1970, on world shares of manufacturing. And here's the G7. It declines gently until about 1990. That was caused by what we nowadays call, or what we used to call, the newly industrializing countries. But after 1990, it plummets from about 2/3 down to half, mimicking the GDP share. Now let's see where those shares went. As it turns out, there's only 7 nations who've seen their share of global manufacturing rise by more than 1/2 of 1% during this time. Just 6 of them. China being by far the largest, going from 3 to 18% of world manufacturing GDP, and the other 6 risers rising from 5 to 9. Here they are: Korea, India, Indonesia, Thailand, Turkey, and Poland. The rest of the world didn't change much. So again, we see this is not something like the steam revolution, which has affected countries all around the world, just brought nations together. It seems to be very specific. The nature of trade also changed. So there's an index called vertical specialization, which sort of measures the extent to which you import stuff to produce stuff that you then export. Something like a rough global value chains thing, or a supply chain thing. As we can see here, this goes back to 1967, the G7 was the ones who did most of this vertical specialization during this time. So just you may remember, the US and Canada signed the Auto Pact in 1965, which was to underpin trade in parts and components and final cars. The European Union set up the common market in 1958 to a large extent to integrate the production structures, and then they did the Single European Act in 1986 in order to deepen the integration. So it was basically value chain kind of stuff, but it was all north-north. From about 1990, Asia, leaving out Japan, saw its role in vertical specialization soar. So all of you know this by many different names: fragmentation, offshoring, outsourcing, global value chains, etc. Many, many names for it. But now Asia is far more important than the G7. Latin America, Africa, nothing. Nothing changed. They don't do it. They still don't do it. So what we see is this is not just nation-specific, it's region-specific. Something's going on in Asia that's not going on in Africa and South America. So it seems that distance, in some sense, is acting differently than it did before. We'll come back to that. Here again, another nature of trade changed. This is more bilateral. So I can look at how trade has changed between particular pairs using this. It's called Intra-Industry Trade, and it measures how your imports are fairly similar to your exports. And this is a bit crude, but basically when you're involved in this value chain stuff, you're importing car parts. You put them together into car components, and you export them. So if you do lots of that, your imports and your exports look a lot like each other. You do it in chemicals and other areas as well. Now here we see that this intra-industry trade between Germany and France is by far the highest. This two-way trade in similar products is by far the highest, but it's been rising and then stabilized. Between US and Mexico, it was nowhere until 1980 or so, and then soared. With Germany and Poland, it was nowhere until late 80s, and then it soared. Japan and Thailand, nowhere until after 1985, and then it soared. So what we see is that the bilateral nature of trade between what I'd like to call headquarter economies, advanced technology economies, and what I'd like to call factory economies, which are low-wage developing nations, changed radically at about the same time that the GDP changed, the poverty changed, and the nature of globalization changed. I've got lots of these slides. I don't know how many you've got time for. Let me see. We've got time for. Well, I got 35 minutes. Okay, an hour and 35 minutes. So, I'm going to do just two more to show you the world changed, just so you believe me that globalization's been changed, that we believe me that we need a new narrative. Okay? So, trade and investment policies changed. In particular, in much of the world, virtually every developing country, protectionism became destructionism in manufactured goods. So this was a revolution. You remember the 60s and 70s, import substitution, Prebish, all this sort of stuff. We were supposed to protect our markets to get the infant industries going so we could have an industrial base which would make us competitive and then we'd be export competitive. Everybody was trying this. So you protected your market in order to foster your industry. From about 1985, 1995, developing countries decided that was wrong. This is here's what US, Japan, and EU tariffs look like throughout this time. They're all down about 5% on average. So basically, by that time, they had already got rid of their tariffs. The developing country tariffs were much higher, and sometime between 85 and 95, all of them started unilaterally lowering their tariffs. This has nothing to do with the GATT or WTO. It has almost nothing to do with regionalism. They unilaterally lowered their tariffs, especially on manufactured goods, especially on parts and components and capital goods. So they decided that the way to encourage industry was not to put tariffs up, but to put them down. And in fact, by now, tariffs in most of the developing world are really quite low. Now here's something that's a little stranger, but those of you who are aficionados of global value chains or global governance will know about BITs. BITs are bilateral investment treaties. So what these are treaties where the host nation essentially grants firms from the home nation the right to sue them in a court that's in Washington, D.C., instead of, for example, Lima or La Paz. So it's a unilateral sacrifice of sovereignty intended to encourage inward foreign direct investment. Now, these things were not very popular for a long time. When people thought about import substitution, multinationals were mean guys, foreign direct investment was essentially stealing the family silver. And so, although they existed way back to 1958, they were uncommon. These were mostly between Europeans. Starting in 1988, the flow of BITs signed per year went from about a dozen to 200 per year. And of course it slacked off because basically every one that needed to be signed had been signed. We have about 3,000 of these now. So basically every developing country has signed a BIT with almost every emitter of FDI. So the entire world governance of FDI is governed by these unilateral concessions to really what are basically firms from the United States, Germany, Japan, and a couple other countries, UK, France. So all this happened at the same time. And I would submit to you that that's suggesting that something has changed that we need to think about and talk about. Last thing, oh actually I lied, there's one more slide. Okay, this is called the smile curve. How many people have heard of the smile curve here? Almost everybody who lives in Asia has heard of this, so come on, go ahead, raise your hands. Everybody have more, nobody raising your hands. Okay, there we go, all right. We really will have much more fun if you respond. Okay, what is the value curve? The value curve looks at how the value of producing a product is divided between prefabrication services, the actual fabrication, and post-fabrication services. And this is hardly empirical work. It's drawn on cocktail napkins around Asia. It was originally invented by the founder of Acer Computers. The idea was in the 1970s and 80s, about a third, and a third was the distribution of value between design and marketing, actual manufacturing, and after-sales service, things like retails or whatever it was. And post-1990, this deepened greatly, creating a like bozo kind of smile here. So the value went up into prefabrication services and post-fabrication services, and actually fabricating things, actually making goods, became commoditized. So in fact, we have lots of perfectly good manufacturers like Nokia who have no factories. And Dyson has no factory. because there's no value in actually fabricating. This is one of the big changes in the world economy, and it happened approximately at the same time. It's closely associated with FDI and global value change and the emergence of new manufacturing powers, etc. Okay, so I don't know if I'm a big fan of Sherlock Holmes. And almost in every Sherlock Holmes short story, there is a moment when, you know, the flustered matron had come in and presented the problem, and then he went out and looked for a few clues here and there. He packs up his pipe and he sits and tries to figure out what's going on. And that's the moment we've arrived at tonight. So what happened? What changed in 1990, or sometime between 85 and 95? Anything you know of changed, dramatically changed your life. Here's a hint for those of you over the age of 30. When did you send your first email? What year did you send your first email? I'm guessing sometime between 85 and 95. That's what changed. I'm going to argue tonight that the Ict Revolution changed globalization in the same way the steam revolution changed it in the 19th century. So let me put that together a bit for you. Let's recap the clues. Clue number one, the change is historic in size, global in reach, but very unevenly spread geographically, quite differently from the first unbundling. Clue number two, the change is related to manufacturing and trade in intermediates. And clue number three, the change transformed developing nations' view of trade and investment policy. Protectionism became destructionism, at least in manufacturers. Now, clearly, I'm not the first one to have noticed that globalization's changed. In fact, right before I came here, I typed in most popular books on globalization, and we have some very well-informed economists. Joe Stiglitz has one, Making Globalization Work. Danny Roderick has one called the Globalization Paradox. We have popular books by very ill-informed journalists like Tom Friedman called The World is Flat, and some by well-informed journalists like Wolf, who calls, what's it called? Anyways, forgot the name of his book, Martin Wolf. But I would assert to you that most of these people are using buzzwords in lieu of analysis. In fact, the whole discussion about how globalization is different and how everything's new reminds me of this old story about the 7 blind men and the elephant. So tell me you all know this. Oh, you all know. Good. We're closer to Asia than usual. So, but for those of you who don't, I brought along a slide. Here it is. So this is the way the story goes. A prince wants to explain to his son the way the world works. And he gets an elephant and brings in 7 men who were blind from birth. And each one touches the elephant. So this guy touches the elephant on the tusk and he goes, I know an elephant. It's a spear, like a spear. This guy touches the tail and says, well, I know what an elephant is. It's like a rope. And this one thinks it's a wall. You get the idea. Then they leave the room and they start to discuss what is an elephant, and they begin to fight. One guy says, well, an elephant's more or less like a wall. I mean, it's not quite a wall, it's a little curved. And the other guy says, what, are you an idiot? An elephant is a spear, just like a spear. And the other one says, neither wall nor spear, it's like a rope. And so they begin to fight. And of course, the point is each one of them has only looked at one part of the phenomena and labeled the phenomena after the part that they liked. This is what we do in globalization. So Danny Roderick and increasingly Paul Krugman now, they talk about hyperglobalization. Hyperglobalization. What does that even mean, hyperglobalization? They have figured out that it's different, so they can't call it globalization, but they don't know why, so they call it hyperglobalization. There we go, buzzword solved. At the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, where they focus on investment all the time, they're sure that it's all about FDI. FDI flows are really increased, and that's really what's driving it all. Then we have these academics on the East Coast of the United States who got hold of this vertical specialization index, and they say, it's the change in trade, in particular parts and components. That's what's changed everything. And then we have Jim O'Neill, who used to be at Goldman, he saw something happening and didn't understand it, so he called it emerging markets. Emerging markets. Emerging, what does that mean? Emerging from what? Why? How? Is Australia doing the same thing as China? Is Thailand doing the same thing as South Africa? Are they all emerging economies? I just don't get it. That's a buzzword, no analysis. The World Bank was perhaps the best. They saw it happening. They focused on the geographic specificity. It's only in Asia, so they called it a miracle, which is what you call it when you don't understand it. And capital flows, that's the IMF. Well, we don't have any IMF fans here tonight, so we'll just move on. Now, to me, the elephant is international movement of firm-specific know-how. That's what changed. That's what's happening after 1990 because of the ICT revolution that didn't happen before. Since it's happening within firms rather than sort of generally through the ether, it only happens where those firms go. Oops. So here is what I'd like to call it. I've been trying several different buzzwords since 2006. None of them have stuck. So the second unbundling might work. But anyways, let's call it the GVC revolution, the global value chain revolution, because that's the one that seems to be catching on. And also it's mildly related to the underlying phenomena. My point is that know-how becomes, first of all, firm-specific, not nation-specific. The narrative of globalization up till now has thought about nations' technology as something as a whole. So when you think about a high-tech country competing with a low-tech country and the Ricardian and all this, Hectorolene that, technology is a national concept. But now with ITC, it's turning out that it's a firm-specific concept that can cross borders easily. So the boundaries of technology are firms, not countries. Second, it's rapidly combined with South labor, but only in a few developing countries. So we have two types of emerging economies. Those where high tech is combined with low wages and they've seen their industry soar at historically unprecedented rates. And those countries who sell commodities to the fast-rising countries. That's Australia. Okay, that's about it. Should we go home? Let me see how much time do I have left. 22 minutes. Oh my goodness. Well, actually I have 150 slides left, so that's okay. So, we need a new narrative for globalization. Globalization is two processes, not one. On the next slide, I'm going to show you is why I came to Adelaide. So please pay attention. In fact, I'm quite sure that I've been talking too fast and showed you too many slides. So I'm going to give you a break. I'm going to tell a joke. So all of you will wake up, okay? So here's a joke. And I have to tell you a joke because, I'm hoping you'll laugh when I'm done. I'll pause. Okay? How much sand does it take? No, I got it wrong. Okay, I'll get it all right. Okay. What do you call an economist buried up to here in sand? Are you all awake? Okay, I'll tell one more time. What do you call an economist buried up to here in sand? The answer is not enough sand. Okay. Now we can move on. I would invite you to think about globalization in terms of a new narrative, which I'd like to call 3 cascading constraints. And I'd like to point out that people and production are spatially bundled together because of 3 types of costs. The cost of moving goods. So in the pre-globalized world, that's why villages produced almost everything. You couldn't move goods over distance, so every village had to make all of its goods. And then production got bundled into factories and industrial districts when the steam revolution went on, not because it costs so much to move the goods around, but because communication costs in this complex process were minimized by having the factory, all the stages together. And that's what universities are about. That's why you tend to put the same departments on the same floors, because nearby means easy communication. The last one, which is a form of this, is face-to-face costs. So face-to-face is really quite different than communication. As any of you who've ever done business or run meetings or tried to run committees understands, face-to-face is totally different than just sending messages. The way I like to think about this is how easy it is to say no to stuff. You know, when people send you, as a professor, for some reason I haven't got this quite down, people feel quite comfortable to ask you to do stuff for free. All sorts of stuff, all sorts of people. They email, will you come and talk? Maybe we'll pay your airfare, maybe not. So I don't know. So I say no a lot. If they send me an email, it's like, thank you very much. I even have an F3 thing. You know, thank you, then boom, no, it's out. If they send a letter, I don't even open it. I just give it to my secretary and she responds. Now, if they call on the phone, that's a little harder. It's harder to say no on the phone. If it's Skype, that's a little bit harder. And if they're actually face-to-face over a meal, it's actually a little bit hard to say no. That's how Richard and I got started on this one, Richard Baldwin. I'm very glad we did that, but it was face-to-face that brought me here tonight. Okay, now when all of those are high, we get the pre-globalized world. So this is the kind of village economy we had before globalization started. The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all the food, everything was within easy walking distance of each other because it was so expensive to move anything over long distances, except silver, silk, and salt. Now, what the steam revolution did was lower the cost of moving goods, but didn't do much for communication costs and face-to-face, because communication back then was essentially moving letters or books. So it was just like trading goods. There was no difference between communication costs and goods costs. And it certainly did nothing for face-to-face. And that led to the first unbundling. Production and consumption were spatially separated. Consumers tended to go to cities, and production tended to cluster in factories and industrial districts, especially in the G7. Now, can you imagine what the second unbundling is going to be? Any guesses here? Cities? Are the cities unbundling? No. It's going to be the factories. But hold on. Before we think about that, let's ask why are these stages of production organized inside the same factory? Or more locally, why are universities physically together, at least most of them? Although soon, massively online courses will kill us all. But anyways, that's later on. Okay, the reason is because stage A, stage B, and stage C are doing complicated things. They're changing it all the time to improve productivity, and you need a two-way flow of goods, people, ideas, investment, training, testing. They have to be in communication with each other all the time to make this thing work. And as it turns out, extreme local clustering makes this all easier, safer, and quicker. Now, the Ict revolution came along and lowered the cost of communication. It's virtually costless to send messages, at least in terms of what it costs it financially. And what that did was lead to the second unbundling, where some of these stages could be performed at great distance from the others and still make it work. Now, given that it was feasible and some of these stages had very different factor intensities, the fact that it was now possible meant that it was inevitable. Scale and comparative advantage moved low-wage or unskilled, intensive stages of production to low-wage countries. That was offshoring or unbundling of the factories. Now, there's a miracle up here. Did any of you see it? The G7's drop in global share, the poverty, the change in trade, it's all here. The blue lines are crossing borders. The flows that used to happen inside factories, the exchange of know-how, is now crossing borders. In particular, it's going from high-tech countries to low-wage countries, but only those that are involved in this global value chain stuff. So globalization now is not simply allowing countries to better exploit their existing comparative advantage, it's changing their comparative advantage. Comparative advantage has been denationalized. It's not a national property. It depends upon what you combine with those of others and make something. That's why Australia is going to lose its car industry. If you take German and Japanese technology and combine it with Thai wages, you have something that Australian workers can't compete with. They could when the Thais and everybody had to make the cars with their own technology, or mostly. But now, when you're taking the best of everything, combining them together, it creates an unbeatable competitiveness in manufacturing. Okay, by the way, that's the slide. Take a mental picture. As you're going down to sleep tonight, put your head on a pillow. Please meditate on it. If you find anything deep and meaningful, let me know. Please send me an email. Okay, now one thing I want to leave you with, or not leave you with, mention, is that there may be a third unbundling. And that's because distance still matters in a big way. I showed you that several times on the slides. And here, what we have here is North American and auto supplier plants. This is from the Detroit Fed. Each red dot is an auto plant. As you can see, they're all centered around Detroit. If we'd gone back to 1950, all of them would have been right in Detroit or certainly in Michigan. Now they're spread all over the United States. This basically follows the US highway system. Most of them are within a day's drive of Detroit. So it's not where the population is. So we can see, although this unbundling and ICT has allowed a dispersion of the production plants, it's not like the world's flat. They still meet near to each other. My argument is that face-to-face is still important. That these have to be close enough so if something goes wrong, a manager or a technician can come out from Detroit or the other way around, fix it and get back in time. Otherwise, it just doesn't work in the supply chain. And I think this is why East Asia has been able to ride the global value chain thing where other nations haven't. It's because it's physically close. Basically, you have to be close to Stuttgart, Nagoya, or Detroit. Otherwise, you can't do this because of face-to-face. Same thing's true pretty much in Europe, although it's around Stuttgart. So this leads to the regionalization of supply chains, and the hypothesis that people are still expensive to move, face-to-face and face-to-machine constraints are still important, but those may change in the next 10 or 15 years with what's called virtual presence. So it's entirely possible that I could have given this lecture from Lausanne without having a day and a half of travel and lots of jet lag. More with that, I probably would have put the tie on, but I could have been wearing my pajama bottoms since it would have been the wrong time of night. And we would be like I was here. We could do this virtual presence. And that technology is not Star Wars or Star Trek. That will happen. And the same with machines, where robots will be in the factories and the technicians will interact with the machinery by remote. When that happens, I believe Africa and South America can join the global value chain revolution, and given the fact that wages are rising in Asia, they probably will. So I think there'll be a third unbundling in the next 10 or 15 years. You can invite me back and see if I was right in 2030. Okay, so let me summarize this with what I think the elephant is. Why did globalization change? The ICT revolution unbundles rich nation factories and offices. The unbundled factories means that rich nation know-how combines with low-wage labor in emerging markets. After all, Japan can't make cars in Thailand using Thai technology and Thai management. If they want the thing to work all together, they have to take Japanese know-how, managerial, technical, marketing know-how, bring it to Thailand, combine it with Thai workers, and then work. So this global value chain, this offshoring, inevitably involves international movement of know-how. Comparative advantage becomes denationalized. High tech goes to low wages, although of course it could have gone the other way around. With open migration, they could have all gone to Germany, Japan, and the United States and worked in the factories there. But the point is that national outcomes may depend upon many nations' advantages. So you wonder, why did it happen in East Asia but not in Africa? It may very well be because a country like Thailand or Cambodia or Vietnam was right in the middle of three high-tech countries: Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and increasingly China. So if you happen to be near one of these countries within the face-to-face constraint, you're okay. Because Thailand is not making cars, or Philippines is not making electric motors with Philippine stuff. They're importing parts from all over the world using technology. They're using Filipino labor and then exporting it. So comparative advantage, or what you're good at, depends upon where you are. This uneven industrialization and growth, well, the miracle only happens where the high tech goes. In other words, we have regional supply chains. This is my hypothesis to explain these. Very little of this has been tested, but lots of it is testable. Increasingly, people are testing, coming out all the time. Okay. Now, those of you who aren't economists, think of England for a while. We're going to go through a bit of economics, and I'll let you know when it's all done. So first, the basic economic differences. The first unbundling, which is sometimes called the old paradigm globalization. Globalization allows nations to exploit their existing comparative advantage. So this is, as trade costs go down and trade barriers go down, Australia can do more of what it was already good at, which is exporting, really good at, exporting minerals and agricultural goods. That's really the leading comparative advantage, but other things as well. The second unbundling, or new paradigm globalization, globalization changes nations' comparative advantage, mainly due to technical, managerial, and marketing know-how moving inside global value chains. So that's why it's been so revolutionary in terms of impact on GDP, why it's been so concentrated, and why both in terms of the names of the countries, but also in terms of the regions. Now let me give you a couple examples of Misthinking Globalisation. So this is a main table from Mike Spence, a Nobel Prize winner. This is probably the 25th global commission trying to figure out why some countries grow faster than others. And so what they did this time was they took 13 examples of high growth countries. They had a definition for that, high growth period. And here are the high growth periods. And then they were trying to figure out what did these countries do right. But they did not think about global value chains. In fact, if you search the report, it's only mentioned once in an offhand comment about how it might also be important. And you'll notice that a lot of these straddle the second unbundling. Some start, many finish before. But they lump them all up together and look to see what is the commonality. Now actually, if you look at this, China, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, it might have occurred to you that there was a regional dimension to this, but it didn't occur to them. Their investigation was to regress national performance on national features. What did they liberalize? What were their policies in terms of banking structure? National outcomes based on national characteristics, because they were thinking in the world where comparative advantage was national. And globalization going forward simply allowed you to do better what you were already good at. Consequently, they didn't find anything, just for the 25th Commission, that we still don't know why some countries grow faster than others. But I can guarantee you, unless you understand this second unbundling and the nature of globalization changing in 1990, you will not be able to, because the performance of China doesn't just depend upon what China did. It depends upon what Japan did, and the United States did, and Thailand did, and Indonesia, Malaysia, and Australia, and all these countries are contributing to the competitiveness of Chinese industry. And if you regress national outcomes on national characteristics, you will miss that. Here's another one of my favorite misthinkings, Hausman and Roderick. So they've developed this way of helping countries decide what industries to go into next. This is like industrial policy 2.0 with incredible graphs. And these guys have convinced serious people about this. It was published in Science magazine. And the World Economic Forum did a whole great big report on it, devoted one of the Davoses to that. There's Hausman, and this is the Rob Davies, the South African Minister for Trade and Investment, carefully listening to which industry they should go into next. And there's Danny Roderick. Danny doesn't go to Davos because, well, it's the World Business Forum. So anyways, these two guys, together with a physicist, looked at how countries in the past had expanded the range of goods they were exporting. And they used social analysis with colored graphs and charts So, here's the core, this is the electronics, machinery. So if you are Peru, all you have to do is see, what are you exporting now? And you look at the node next to you, and that's what you should do. What's wrong with that thinking? What's wrong with that thinking is it's assuming, using past data, that these were all generated by national characteristics. So then you just had to find which successful nation's characteristics yours were most likely like, and then you could do the same. So there is no regional value chains in here, there's no movement of technology, there's nothing in here. So they did this whole thing, and it's completely wrong. But believe me, people are designing industrial policies based on this. Okay, I could go on, but I don't want to say more bad things about my colleagues. Well, actually I do, but I don't have much time. So, key differences for policy. First of all, the first unbundling, the old globalization, it was slow, predictable, and controllable. At least since World War II, it was mainly controlled by how fast you lowered your tariffs. So governments were in charge. Moreover, globalization affected an economy via sectors and skill groups in a predictable way. So let's say you're Germany and trade costs are coming down. You realize you've lost the t-shirt industry to Bangladesh, and you're guessing that the next industry that goes will be intensive in unskilled labor. That'll go to Portugal or somewhere else. And you're world beater in capital goods. So you're guessing as the world gets more open, you'll be able to export more goods like that. So you can define sunrise sectors and sunset sectors based on what had happened before, because globalization is simply letting factories compete more with each other. In the second unbundling, it's sudden, individual, and unpredictable, because you do not know what's going to be offshored next. At least in part because it depends upon all sorts of economics that we don't understand. Why do things have to be close to each other? Why does face-to-face matter? There's been some work on this empirically, but we really don't understand what's going next. Moreover, it is not controllable. You can't turn off the internet. You can't reduce, or you can't reasonably say we're going to raise the cost of telecoms and make it difficult for people to take airplanes. That's not controllable. Moreover, it's individual. Because of this unbundling, the factories and offices unbundling, a stage may leave, so you may have high-skilled workers in a hospital being harmed by globalization, and low-skilled workers being harmed in a hospital by globalization, when hospitals are a winning sector. So it's more individual than it was before, yet almost all of our policies are based on sectors and skill groups, because governments, using the old narrative, believe they can predict what globalization will do, and they know they have to move workers from sunset sectors to sunrise sectors by upgrading their skills. That's the primary ticket in rich countries. And in developing countries, they want to get more of these factories. So one way of thinking about it is globalization is happening with a finer degree of resolution, and that has implications for policy which are quite extensive. I've been writing, mostly what I've been writing in the last 7 years is about that kind of policy for various people. So here's a list of policy rethinks. So I started, the Finnish Prime Minister was mostly interested in social and education policy. So I wrote this paper for them, and it had a certain success in 2006. I even participated in a press conference with the Prime Minister in 2006. It was by video link. The whole conference was in Finnish, from start to finish. And I was like, the whole time, yeah. Once in a while I'd hear Baldwin. And then the journalist said, so, do you think our children should be learning to read and write or learning to learn? And I go, excuse me? But, I was a professor, so I gave him an answer. The answer is this. This new world means your children will have to change jobs 5 or 6 times in their lifetime in a successful career. So the idea that you need to spend 7 to 10 years getting an incredibly specialized bit of knowledge is probably not the way to go. People will have to change. We will need continuing education. And social policy has to support that. And it's social policy based on workers, not their skill groups, not the industries they're coming from. Industrial policy is completely different. We used to try and decide who are the winners of tomorrow, and we would, it was like material or powdered metals or whatever it is. And this is telling you, you can't do that. Industrial policy matters, but it's going to happen at the level of stages. It's going to be micro industrial policy, which has pluses and minuses to it, but it will not be like we're going to do a car industry. We're going to do a steel industry. It's going to be you're going to do one thing good, and then you're going to try and densify your participation in the value chain doing that. Oops, my time is up. Hold on, but actually I have a couple minutes left. Who's the chairman here? Okay. Let me just finish this. I'm having so much fun here. Okay, urban policy. This is mostly for rich countries like Australia. Think about the smile curve. Where is the value being created in the tertiary sector in the world today? It's rich country cities. So rich countries should be thinking about urban policy as their competitiveness policy. And they should be thinking of cities as 21st century factories, because the agglomeration of talents can resist small changes in wages and allows the rapid reconnecting and reshuffling that the economy will need. So there's two more. Misthinking trade policy. First of all, I'm going to skip through this one pretty fast. Second, unbundling changes trade and the necessary disciplines. The problem is that there's only about 30 or 40 nations engaged in global value chains, and the rest are either afraid of them, don't understand them, or actually trying to kill them. So in the WTO, you have 30 or 40 countries interested in moving trade policy into the 21st century, and about 80 countries worried about the 20th century agenda that was set basically in the 1990s. So as a result, the world has left the WTO behind, and we're getting these mega regionals like TPP and TTIP and EU, Japan, and Japan, Canada, etc. The old Quad is getting back together again to set the rules. So the current trajectory is pretty bit worrying. A few countries are getting together to write the new rules of world trade. And that happened twice in the 20th century. Once in the 1930s with the idea of keeping down Germany and Japan, and that did not end well. Some people think that's what TTIP is about, keeping down China. In the 1940s, a group of advanced countries set up rules for world trading system and invited everybody to join, and we got the GATT and global prosperity. We yet don't know which way this thing's going, but it's something we should worry about. And unless you understand that it's all about global value chains, and the countries have very different attitude towards these things, you will never really understand what the deep problem is. Okay, so I'll skip some of these. Trade change, the political economy change, Doha, TTIP, and I'll skip some of that. I want to talk about development policy for a second, because we're in Asia where a lot of countries are developing and hoping to develop. Factory Asia, so to speak. So the traditional industrialization involved building a supply chain, and Korea was the last country that did that. But of course, all the G7 did it. The United States, UK, Germany, Japan, all these countries built up an industrial base and then became competitive. That's the way it was done during the first wave of globalization. After the second unbundling, industrialization means joining a supply chain. No one can have the whole industry. Germany doesn't make cars. US doesn't make cars. Airbus doesn't make planes. They make plane parts. They design planes and they put them together and market them. So really, you can't think about the old way of developing an industrial base. You have to join a supply chain. Then the problem is, how do you densify your participation in it? How do you move beyond just simple assembly? So some key points here is, first of all, industrialization has got easier but less significant. So Vietnam, for instance, has recently started exporting high-tech engine parts to Japan. Now, if you had seen that in 1960, you would have said, wow, Vietnam has made it. If they have the industrial base to export this to Japan, they must be really good. But nowadays, all it means is that the Japanese firms have bought a particular part of the value chain to Vietnam and given them everything they had except labor. So it's easier, but less significant. Second, the second unbundling killed import substitution. In other words, if you're still trying to do import substitution, forget about it. Because China is taking low wages and high tech And you will never compete with that if you're Brazil or Argentina and trying to use those wages. You can't even compete if you're the UK. If you want to do everything with UK technology, parts, etc., you still won't compete because people are combining the best. Here's an interesting thing. This is I think a whole bunch of development theory needs to be done. This is a cry for research. So there's recently, a couple years ago, a world database came out on these global value chains. And what this is showing is the percentage of exports that are imported. So you're exporting manufactured goods, and you have to have some imports. And what we look is importing to export, and we look at the GDP per capita. And we see as countries get richer, they start having a higher share of imported intermediates in their exports, and then it falls. So this is a stylized fact that's pretty strong in the data, but there's no theory, and nobody's tested it. But you can see that it's almost like the Chenery curve. It's like, seems to suggest how globalization should work, which industries you should go through. And I'm like bring this out, hopefully younger economists who have better econometrics than me can sort this all out. Okay, so that really is the last slide. I want to end here. And I can never talk in public without advertising my favorite website, Research-Based Policy Analysis and Commentary by Leading Economists. So I'll just stop right there.
Good. Thanks very much, Richard. Richard, have we got time for a couple of questions or comments? Yes. So we'll do that for a few minutes. If we do advertise, I think it's 6:30 close, so if you've got another question, we'll understand. But let me take a question.
Just a quick question. BRIC countries, or BRICSA, we know where China sits in your model, but where are the others? Brazil, is it a resource country in there?
Yeah.
Russia, is it a resource country?
Yes, I didn't.
South Africa?
South Africa's resource country. So I have a slide I didn't bring. I mean, it's on my hard drive here. But what you can do with this, there's a database called Trade and Value Added database that's online from the OECD, and it shows what is the domestic value added in your gross exports. So the point is that now when, say, Australia exports a car, if they ever exported a car, it would only have a certain share of domestic value added in it. And you can do this by industry, by country, so you can see from, say, 95 to 2005, how much of the growth in domestic value added has been in services and manufacturing and commodities, natural commodities. And so you naturally see the emerging countries into two groups: those who did it through manufacturing, so their gross, their net, their value added, domestic value added has grown mostly in manufacturing. Others have grown in services. Others have grown in natural resources. So I don't have that with you, but that's basically it.
You mentioned in terms of, let's say, thoughts toward the future, in terms of how we look at education, and you cited the anecdotal evidence of, let's say, a person's going to change his or her job 5 or 6 times in the course of his life. But I understand that to be that a person may well make these changes, but they're going to still stay within the same industry. So, in my mind, that would be evidence to, well, I agree with what's happening in the world. Obviously, you disagree with what I observe. But that may not necessarily be, more specialization, because you're ultimately within the same industry. Yeah, you may have a number of careers, but you're kind of refining these skills across time.
Right. So first of all, this is an empirical question, and I think it's something that needs a lot more research. And actually, we're fortunate that the labor market data is very rich. And in countries like Denmark and Norway, they're starting to track people and how they're changing by what they're doing, the tasks they're doing. So what you're getting at is one hypothesis is that basically people do a task, and they get good at that task, but which industry or which sector or which firm they do the task for changes. So that's one possibility. But I think there's also anecdotal evidence that people are also changing sectors. So I would just leave that an open question for research. But I would suggest to you what my point tonight was. If you think about the impact of globalization for what happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and prepare your education policy based on that, you're missing what's going forward. So you have to keep in mind this sudden, individual, and unpredictable changes in industrial structure when we design our education policy. But lots of research needs to be done.
Let me take one more, then we'll have to close.
Okay. So, as a German, the big event in 1990 is obviously the fall of communism and reunification.
Yes.
So, in a counterfactual, imagine communism doesn't fall. Does your whole story basically require China to open up? Does it require Russia and maybe communism to fall and socialism to go down?
Right. No. So let me take that in two ways. When I give this kind of talk in Europe, everybody points out that there was this tectonic plate shift in 1989, and the end of communism, the end of history, all that sort of stuff. When I give it in Japan, everybody notes that in 1985 the yen started appreciating, and that's what caused all the offshoring. And when you go down, when you give it in the United States, they all talk about the Makedora program, which got started about the same time. So this is the elephant story. In my mind, what changed was ICT. That was an exogenous technological change which allowed things which weren't possible before. I wouldn't go so far as to say that caused the fall of the Soviet Union, but even if you left the whole Soviet bloc out of this story, it would have been pretty much the same. Poland, I think, was the only one in there that shook loose from that particular thing. But Turkey and all the other countries industrialized outside of that. So I think it was an important thing. I think it changed a lot of global politics, but I don't think it basically changed the nature of globalization.
Folks, we're going to have to draw it to a close here. I'm going to thank Richard in 30 seconds, but let me take a commercial break first. On behalf of the Economic Society of Australia, there's a public lecture on Wednesday, the 20th of November, on the very important question of, does money make us happy? So Professor Andrew Clark's talking about the Eastern paradox of monetary policy on the 20th of November. Mark's got some flyers for you, they'll be out the back. Which brings me to thanks. Thank you so much, Richard, for joining us. Thank you, Richard, also, our Richard, for confronting this Richard face to face and asking him to join us. It's been a delightful evening. Thank you for taking us through the clues to a very important question, but also thank you for drawing out some really interesting implications of that, the things we should be thinking about now. Thank you very much, Richard Baldwin.